This video is a true story about a girl named Laura. That's not her real name for confidentiality reasons. She was a strange case of a young girl who just would not grow or gain any weight. No matter how much she was fed, even when being fed through a tube, the doctors were completely baffled. She had endless tests and exploratory surgeries and they couldn't figure out what was wrong, which is kind of tragic because it was pretty straightforward actually. And you can feel free to guess what the problem was. Why wasn't she gaining any weight or height? What was holding her back? I think it's a really fascinating case, not just because of how simple the solution technically was, but I think because how this true story can also apply to so many other situations too. At 4 years old, Laura weighed just 26 pounds. Despite having been fed a high-calorie diet via a tube inserted through her nose for weeks. The stack of her medical files that confronted me at the nurse's station was about 4 feet high, taller than the shrunken little girl herself. Laura's story helped us learn more about how children respond to early experience. The story comes from the book The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which I have made a video on one of the chapters from it before. YouTube didn't really recommend that video to anyone, but I'm trying again with another chapter because I really like getting to talk about this book. It details a lot of the cases from the child psychiatrist Dr. Bruce Perry. It's just a really great read. I said in my recent Mary Bell video that unless I change my mind for some reason, I'm not too keen to make more true crime stories. However, true stories that focus on the therapy and the growth of a person, I think those are things I'm likely to continue making. So if you do enjoy these kind of videos, please do give it a like or a comment, because YouTube is in the habit right now when it comes to my new videos of only recommending the A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones ones, which is obviously great. It'd just be nice to get some more therapy related content back into the algorithm again for a bit of variety. Either way, let's just begin. Laura's files contained literally thousands of pages of documents, detailing visits with endocrinologists, gastroenterologists, nutritionists, and other various medical specialists. There were endless lab reports of blood work, chromosome tests, hormone levels, biopsies. The documents included results from even more invasive tests, which had used scopes inserted into her throat to examine her stomach, and scopes inserted rectally to examine her bowels. There were dozens of reports from consulting physicians. The poor girl had even had exploratory laparoscopy, in which doctors inserted a tube into her abdomen to scrutinise her internal organs. A snippet of her small intestine had been clipped off and sent to the National Institute of Health for analysis. I don't know if I pronounced all those words correctly, it's a bit of a tongue twister, that paragraph, but poor girl is the right phrase, I think. I know obviously tests do need to be carried out a lot of the time and you can't make them a pleasant experience exactly. However, we shouldn't forget all the same how genuinely traumatizing this kind of stuff can be for a small child to be subjected to increasingly invasive tests in a very sterile and strange environment from people you don't know. And more generally, I think the feeling I get here is frantic, which is understandable. Something is wrong with this child. We can't figure out what. You can only imagine how panicked that would leave the mum, and then also no doubt Laura. That is kind of part of the possible trauma there too. There is something wrong with you and we don't know how to resolve it, and we're just going to do test after test and whisk you all over the place and get nowhere. That would be terribly frightening. Finally, after being on a special gastrointestinal research unit for a month, a social worker pressured Laura's physicians to get a psychiatry consult. Seems kind of funny that they had to be pressured into that. It doesn't say exactly when this story took place. I would guess it's somewhere between the 90s and 2000s, based on the other cases in this book. I don't work in hospitals or anything, so I would be curious to know how common this sort of thing would be nowadays. That kind of cultural feeling that psychologists and psychiatrists aren't proper doctors, that they just come in and they complicate the purer science of things, therefore wanting to resolve issues without their help, just focusing on the medical stuff, you know? Regardless of what kind of doctors though, they all seem to fall into a similar problem. Just as the gastroenterology fellows thought they'd discovered a case of intestinal epilepsy when they first saw Laura years before, the shrinks, too, had a novel theory about Laura's case. The psychologist who came for the initial consultation specialised in eating disorders, and he believed he was seeing the first documented instance of infantile anorexia. There is an excitement from the doctors to be discovering a new case or a new illness, a new phenomenon, you know? Some of that excitement may be a reaction to the general anxiety in the environment around this child, an eagerness to find the answer, to resolve that anxiety, to rework the panic into an excitement. Maybe. Therefore, having a theory and diving at it with total eagerness. And this psychologist contacted Bruce Perry because he had more experience with academic publishing, basically saying, look, I've got this case of what I think is infantile anorexia, can you come in for a consultation about it? Which, yeah, is where Bruce Perry enters the story. He told me that the child had to be purging secretly, or else getting up in the night to exercise furiously. Otherwise, how could she be fed so many calories and still not grow? I mean, to me, that sounds incredibly unlikely, both in terms of her age and the amount of calories she is being fed, but with everything else failing with that eagerness, you can see why he might come to that conclusion. They just want an answer, and if it's not her body, then it must be her directly. She must be the cause, which is a problem in itself. You see, Bruce Perry went along, read some of the case files, and then popped in for a quick introduction to Laura and her mum. In the girls' hospital room, I found a distressing scene. Laura's 22-year-old mum, Virginia, was watching television, seated about 5 feet away from her child. Mother and daughter were not interacting. Tiny, emaciated Laura was sitting quietly, her eyes big, staring at a plate of food. She also had a feeding tube, which pumped nutrients into her stomach. I would later learn that Virginia had been discouraged from interacting with Laura during mealtimes by the eating disorders psychologist. The problem with Laura being seen as the cause is how easily that derails into kind of blaming her, you know? And with all of this anxiety in the air, all that uncertainty, stress, could that potentially feed into a kind of resentment and a shame towards Laura for what she's supposedly putting everyone through? This is all your fault, you're being bad for not growing. Are we now shaming a child here? From a more, I guess, organisational dynamics point of view, these questions are important, I think. Obviously, the doctor's focus is always on finding the problem and treating that, but are the general, I suppose, transference feelings in the air around this case causing people to perceive things wrong or act in unhelpful ways? Is that further muddying the understanding of this girl? I don't know, I wasn't there. This is just a random thought to throw out, but it's interesting. This was supposed to stop Laura, the alleged cunning, infantile anorexic, from manipulating her mother around food and meals. The theory was that people with anorexia enjoy the attention they get when they don't eat, and use it to control other family members. Denying them this reward was supposed to aid recovery. But all I could see here was a despondent, skinny little girl and a disengaged mother. It feels like neglect, and it feels shaming to be casting a 4-year-old child in the light of some devious manipulator. I guess I can see where they're coming from, because anorexia is often partly to do with control, and sitting there burning a hole into Laura's head with your stare, demanding she eats, that might not be the best approach either, but this is a child feeling shamed, who has probably had a lot of her emotional needs come second to being seen as this more physical, medical problem, this case study. It feels as though the girl is being neglected in place of the medical problem, and yeah, transference-wise, that could be very fitting, as we will see. From here, Bruce Perry decides to ask a little about Laura's past and her family, which in Laura's case meant the mum, here renamed to Virginia, so let's get to that. Although, first, hello. As much as it feels wrong to interrupt a true story like this with a sponsor segment, I did just lose my car to flooding, and I need to try and afford another one. Plus, it's World Anvil. You'll all know how passionate I am about them by now, so please make do with this. Also, I have a Patreon page, by the way. People say I don't promote that enough. World Anvil is a really cool thing, and they're still sponsoring me, till death do us part. Listen to me passionately talk about them. World Anvil is an online tool for world building, the anviling of worlds, character creation, campaign building, story planning, and even writing, and a load more stuff that can be great for anyone with creative projects or games. I use it for the planning of my novel. My organisation is chaotic, so World Anvil really helps. I love the way you can create timelines of events with hyperlinks from those pages to a character bio or some other event or information or whatever. Like, my memory isn't the best for the minor details of stuff I invent, so when I'm reading back information about the history of my novel's world and I think, who is this person? I can only half remember. Or what order did these events happen in? Why did that become a social custom? Whatever. I can very easily click a hyperlink to a different page I wrote and check. The ability to create entire timelines based based on your own invented calendars and be able to link everything to it, including changes in the maps for if a city gets destroyed or something like that. That is so damn cool. And there are other tools too. Not all of them are ones I need for my novel personally, but they all still look really handy, and I've always found everything pretty easy to use. If it's your thing, they also have a Discord and they run all sorts of events and community support and stuff, like this summer camp they've been running. It's all really great and I enjoy getting to promote them. So there is a link in the description and there's a pinned comment that entitles you to
51% off. Yep, it's 51 now.
All their subscriptions with the code TREE. If you want to try it out first, they have a free version so you can get familiar, you know, take your time, take it out for a nice dinner and see where things lead. Yeah, well done, Anvil. So I have made 2 true crime videos in the past on this channel, and one of the things I quickly realised about other true crime videos is that people have a tendency to either blame the killer, criminal, perpetrator as evil and bad, or to blame their parents as evil and bad, normally one parent especially. Like, it's as simple as that. Find who to blame, there's your answer, you move on to the next case. And whilst this isn't a true crime story, what I do like about this case here, and in fact many others in this book, is that it illustrates that sometimes things aren't a case of somebody being bad, malicious, cruel, abusive, exactly. I suppose it kind of is, depending on how you define those words, but sometimes it can tragically be more to do with a lack of experience and knowledge than anything else. Virginia grew up in foster care, abandoned at birth by a drug-addicted mother, father unknown. Virginia had grown up at a time when it was common for the child welfare system to move infants and toddlers to a new foster home every 6 months. The rationale was that this way they wouldn't become too attached to any particular caregiver. That seems completely mad by today's understanding. It's kind of shocking. Forming attachments is exactly what an infant needs. Why be actively preventing that from happening? The child-parent or caregiver bond is so important, especially in those first years of life where the brain is busy forming its most connections, laying the kind of foundation for the rest of your development. And these people that repeatedly care for you, every time you have this strange, scary feeling called hunger or thirst or whatever else, a feeling you don't quite know what it is or if it'll ever stop, and it terrifies you so you cry, but then these caregivers appear, time and time again, to resolve the problem, to soothe and comfort you and feel okay again. More than okay, actually. It feels pleasurable, loving. And the more it happens consistently, the more you start to trust that they will be there for you, the less overwhelming those fears start to become. And more than that, they sing to you, play with you, smile, hold you, rock you, pleasurable, loving experiences. You need repeated experiences that can bundle together in what you might call a relationship with this person. Your first basis for understanding what relationships are. Then, with affection and attachment to you, you experience that. You don't just learn about yourself, you also learn what attachments can be like. This is how people interact, this is how it can feel, this is how people might feel about me, this is how I might feel about it. And that's just talking in a general sense. Your brain forms so many important connections to your overall development in so many different areas. But the kind of attachments you experience in early life become, in many ways, the template you then use to go out and form other attachments of your own. The problem here is that Virginia herself didn't get those repeated experiences growing up, or at least not to a good level, particularly in those first 3 years. There was no consistency and everything kept changing because of the inhumane welfare policy there. As she got older, she was settled into a more permanent home with loving, highly moral foster parents. Highly Christian, that taught her manners, taught her that stealing was wrong, drugs are bad, taught her many of the basic things a child needs to learn. The foster parents wanted to adopt her, and she wanted that too, but it was also talk from caseworkers about reuniting her with her biological parents, so adoption never quite happened, and then when she turned 18, the state was no longer legally responsible. Virginia was told she had to leave their home. The parents were told not to have any further contact with her at all, and they had to comply for the sake of getting future work as foster parents, so that was it. It's horrible. Virginia lost the only parents she'd ever really known. Cut off from her loved ones with no clear-cut rules to follow and seeking affection, Virginia rapidly became pregnant. The father of her child left her, but she wanted the baby to love, and she wanted to do the right thing, as her foster parents taught her. She sought prenatal care and was quickly enrolled into a good program for high-risk mothers. Unfortunately, as soon as the baby was born, she was no longer qualified for that program because she wasn't pregnant anymore. After she gave birth, she was on her own. Unfortunately, there are all too many stories about parents or single parents being left alone in overwhelming situations to care for a child that they can't adequately support. Virginia's example is interesting because she absolutely tries and she understands the basics. She knew to feed, dress, bathe Laura. She sought to be a good and moral person, but she never really had that proper early template for attachment. And in the book's words, having had her own early attachments abruptly and brutally terminated, she didn't have what some might call the maternal instinct. How do you initiate an attachment and teach it to your child when you don't really know yourself? Bruce Perry describes her as lost emotionally, compounded by the fact that no one had thought to specifically instruct her to provide the loving physical interactions that infants need, and she didn't feel compelled to do them on her own. She was lacking that less conscious instincts that there was pleasure to be gained from her soothing a child and offering it attention and affection. She probably would have tried to engage in these things more if she'd been told to, but yeah, she wasn't. She didn't rock her, didn't sing to her, didn't coo or stare into her eyes or count her perfect tiny toes over and over. Without these physical and emotional signals that all mammals need to stimulate growth, Laura stopped gaining weight. Which is the answer, essentially. The term here is failure to thrive, a syndrome that occurs most often with abused or neglected children, something the book explains has been documented for centuries, most commonly in orphanages where there isn't often enough attention and care to go around. That's kind of what's so sad about this case. It wasn't an undiscovered phenomenon. It was very much known about, and even when Virginia first sought medical help when Laura was 8 weeks old, she was then correctly diagnosed with failure to thrive. However, the diagnosis wasn't properly explained to Virginia, so after Laura was discharged, she was only given nutritional advice, no advice on mothering or given any social support. Having had it diagnosed once though, for medical teams to much later ignore that seems mad. Generally, the book suggests the medical teams ignored issues of neglect because physicians could be culturally a little dismissive towards psychology babble, and because Virginia didn't appear like someone who was neglectful. Here she was actively seeking help for her child, so it couldn't be anything to do with neglect. It must be some strange new exciting phenomenon to explore. And he ended up getting lost in this frantic rabbit hole, slipping through the institutional cracks to the extent that the blindingly obvious answer just goes missing. Endless surgeries and tests carried out on a scared and confused child for no reason. So why exactly doesn't she gain weight? Well, it's this lack of physical and emotional care, affecting her hormones. I'm afraid I'm going to have to read quite a long quote here. The problem is similar to what in other mammals is called runt syndrome. In litters of rats and mice, or even in puppies and kittens, without outside intervention, the smallest, weakest animal often dies a few weeks after birth. The runt doesn't have the strength to stimulate the mother's nipple to produce adequate milk, or to elicit adequate grooming behaviours from the mother. The mother neglects the runt physically, not licking or grooming him as much as she does the others. This, in turn, further limits his growth. Without this grooming, his own growth hormones turn off, so even if he does somehow get enough to eat, he still doesn't properly grow. The mechanism, rather cruelly for the runt, directs resources to the animals best able to utilise them. The mother feeds the healthier animals preferentially since they have the best chance of surviving and passing on her genes. Despite all the food in the world, Laura wasn't getting the emotional stimulation, so basically her growth hormones switched off. Her body treated the food as waste rather than nutrition for her. Without love, children literally don't grow. Laura wasn't anorexic. Like the scrawny runt in a litter of puppies, she just wasn't receiving the physical nurturing her body needed to know that she was wanted and that it was safe to grow. It's one of those facts that even today a lot of people would roll their eyes at as wishy-washy, lovey-dovey stuff. Oh, children don't grow without love. But it's true. Virginia was a devoted mother who fed Laura well, washed, dressed, kept a perfectly clean house that I suspect social services would see no issues of neglect with at all from the outside. Virginia was very well intentioned, but this is why education and support for parents does really matter. We can't just take for granted that every adult and parent out there knows what we might know ourselves about parenting, so what happened about Laura? Mama P was a large, powerful woman. She moved with confidence and strength. She wore a large, brightly coloured muumuu and had a scarf around her neck. She'd come for a consultation about Robert, the 7-year-old child she was fostering. Now, who Robert isn't really the focus here. He was a child struggling with trauma and various behavioural problems that got him into a lot of trouble at school due to his rages, as they're called. Curiously, these rages weren't too much of a problem at home with Mama P, but the school had had enough and they demanded more outside help for Robert, so Bruce Perry appears out of thin air to explain about the stress response and then suggests a treatment of clonidine, to which Mama P says, "You will not use drugs on my baby," and after failing to persuade her, Dr. Perry tries a different tact. "Mama P, how do you help him?" "I just hold him and rock him. I just love him. At night when he wakes up scared and wanders the house, I just put him in bed next to me, rub his back, and sing a little, and he falls asleep. What seems to calm him down when he gets upset during the day?" "Same thing. I just put everything down and hold him, and rock in the chair. Doesn't take too long, poor thing." At the time, Bruce Perry was quite startled by this, and you can see why. It's an approach that wouldn't be appropriate for every child. It's the sort of thing a lot of people would brand to babyish or mollycoddling, but Robert is a child who suffered serious abuse and neglect that has hindered his emotional development. This isn't an overly anxious mother stifling a child, but one responding to their particular needs. Mama P discovered, long before we did, that many young victims of abuse and neglect need physical stimulation like being rocked and gently held, comfort seemingly appropriate to far younger children. She knew that you don't interact with these children based on their age, but based on what they need, what they may have missed during sensitive periods of development. The solution was basically Dr. Perry remembering Mama P, digging out her phone number and asking if she'd be alright for both Laura and Virginia to move in with her. And it does 3 things. One is Mama P can provide a lot of what Laura most needs. Secondly, her care can also teach Virginia how to respond to these needs of Laura's, how to do a lot of this stuff herself. And thirdly, it will even give Virginia some of what she missed out during her own upbringing, some of that similar emotional development. And it works, you could say, miraculously well. They documented all of Laura's food and her weight, and eating exactly the same amount of calories she had the previous month in hospital that had barely maintained her 26-pound weight. This next month with Mama P, she now gained 10 pounds. In just the first month, she then went on to grow healthily, and they stayed with Mama P for about a year. Afterwards, the 2 women remained tight friends, and Virginia moved into Mama P's neighbourhood so that she could remain in close touch. Laura became a bright little girl, similar to her mother in that she tended to be emotionally distant, but with a powerful moral compass. Virginia went on to have a second child, which she raised without any similar issues. Laura herself grew up happy enough, it seems, however naturally both still bear the effects of their upbringing to an extent. Both can mimic the many normal social interactive cues, but neither feels naturally pulled to be social, to spontaneously smile, or to express warm, nurturing and physical behaviours such as a hug. True stories never quite come with the happy ending you want, do they? It's the nature of life to never have that perfectly concluded ending, and for happiness to never be this absolute thing. Bruce Perry compares the lack of emotional development Virginia and Laura got in their first 3 years to children learning a foreign language later in life, where if you're learning a language young enough, you're likely to become natural at it, obviously. Learning it later on, they can become pretty much fluent. However, Virginia and Laura will never speak the language of love without an accent, which is either a really poignant way or a really damning way to summarise the situation, depending on how you interpret that quote. I see it as poignant. This is a fitting story, I think, because, to mention my Mary Bell video again, in that video of Mary's development in the Red Bank Special Unit, there was this quote of a staff member. He thought that love conquers all, and of course it can do a lot. Well, let's say without the atmosphere he created at Red Bank, nothing can be done. But all the love in the world can't give people like us the skill to help children unlock their troubled minds. For that you need teaching and training. Which is absolutely true for many children needing special support. However, Laurie's story highlights that first bit of the quote, that nothing can be done without experiences of love, affection, and genuine care. Enough is never done to support and educate parents, particularly when raising children in those earliest, most crucial years to their development. Our systems, they kind of tend to be reactive and only swoop in when something has obviously gone wrong, rather than to prevent the possible problems occurring in the first place, which is a big generalisation from me. But yeah, it's common that parents are left to handle everything alone, and then shamed if they fail to handle it. You can't just leave struggling parents on their own without support and help. All of that desperately matters, especially from the beginning, not just later down the line when a problem has become obvious. But I'm not going to get carried away with a passionate speech or anything. Let me know what you think though. Give this video a like, tell me what I missed, what I got wrong, or explained badly, or if you think I should have given a passionate speech. Subscribe, support me on Patreon maybe, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Luke Hoare, Treat Trukaba, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Billy Lee Myers Jr., Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell and Michael Hart. Thank you.